Welcome to The Last Hike. Today I'm going to uncover the Death Valley hike where three friends wasted their own water as a joke after strangers warned them to turn back. A belief that their preparation was enough, combined with the confidence that came from previous hikes, may have led them to underestimate how quickly conditions could change. What seemed like a harmless joke became chilling knowing what happened next. It was July 19th, 2017, in Death Valley National Park, California. That summer, Death Valley was already experiencing the kind of extreme heat that makes midsummer hiking dangerous. Weather officials had warned of dangerous temperatures across the region that week, and conditions were expected to become increasingly hazardous during the afternoon hours. Colton Delgado was 24 years old and worked as a personal trainer in Henderson, Nevada. To the people who knew him, he was the planner of the group, the guy who mapped out the route, checked the distance, and figured out how much water they would need before every trip. He even kept notes from past hikes, writing down things like distances and what he learned along the way. Friends said he was usually the one making sure everyone had their gear ready and packed the night before. I actually respect this about him. Most people don't plan this carefully, and it makes what happened even harder to sit with. For this hike, Colton had looked into the canyon route weeks ahead of time. He compared mileage estimates he found online with a map of the area and eventually decided they should bring about a gallon of water each for the day. On paper, that amount lined up with common hiking advice for a trip of that distance. But what he couldn't fully account for was just how intense the heat was going to be that week. Perrin Sampson, 23, came from Phoenix, Arizona, where he worked as a construction estimator. His job often meant spending long days around construction sites in extreme heat, sometimes when temperatures climbed into the triple digits. Because of that, he was likely more familiar with working in hot environments. But a desert hike was a completely different situation. There were no shaded areas, no water coolers, no nearby vehicles, just miles of open terrain with nothing to rely on except what they carried with them. I get why he'd feel prepared for heat, but standing on a job site with a cooler nearby is nothing like being 2 miles into a canyon with no way out. Then there was Mackie Ashford, 21, the youngest of the group. He was a college student and, according to people close to him, the more spontaneous one. He documented the trip as it happened, posting pictures along the way, the trail, the scenery, even the little moments between stops. That morning, before starting the hike, he uploaded one final photo at the trailhead. He was smiling, holding up his water bottle, with the warning signs behind him in the background, even making a joke about them in the caption. Looking at that photo, he's got no idea. And honestly, neither would I in his shoes. The three friends had actually hiked together several times before this trip. In the years leading up to it, they had taken on challenging routes through places like the Red Rock Canyons of southern Utah and the dry desert areas outside Las Vegas. After completing those hikes successfully, friends described the group as experienced with challenging terrain and accustomed to planning longer, more demanding routes. They had experience dealing with heat, long distances, and tough terrain, so they probably felt like they knew what they were doing. Friends and investigators later suggested that familiarity with desert hiking may have influenced some of the choices the group made during the Death Valley trip. There was no evidence that the hikers believed they were putting themselves in unnecessary danger, and no one could know exactly how they assessed the risk that day. However, their previous experience with difficult terrain and hot environments may have contributed to their decision to continue with the hike, choose their planned route, and rely on the amount of water they had prepared. The three had driven into the park 2 days earlier, stopping first at a visitor center roughly 40 minutes from the trailhead, where a ranger on duty gave a standard verbal briefing to all visitors that week regarding the active heat warning, a briefing that park records confirm was delivered to visitors on a rotating basis throughout the day. The group later spoke with visitor center staff, where they received the standard heat warning information provided to visitors that week. Investigators later reviewed staff records and recollections as part of reconstructing the group's preparation before the hike. They spent that first night in a motel roughly 30 miles outside the park boundary, and the following day scouted a shorter, more popular trail nearby as a warm-up hike, completing it without incident in the cooler morning hours before temperatures climbed. Death Valley in the middle of July is honestly one of the hottest places on the planet. During summer afternoons, temperatures in the region can climb above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions where even short hikes become dangerous. I'll say it plainly, the ground itself becomes a hazard at those temperatures. And that's before you even factor in the air. The trail the group chose for their final day was an out-and-back route through Golden Canyon near Furnace Creek, heading toward the Red Cathedral area of Death Valley National Park. The trail was not one of the park's most remote backcountry routes, but in the middle of July, its accessibility could be misleading. Much of the route offered little shade, no reliable sources of water, and limited cell service in deeper sections of the canyon. Under normal conditions, it was a manageable desert hike, but during a period of dangerous heat, the same exposed terrain could become extremely extremely dangerous. Those conditions were already known through trail advisories and warnings posted at the trailhead that week. As the group moved deeper into the canyon, the landscape around them started to change. The walls became taller and the path narrowed in certain sections, creating enclosed areas where shade was limited and heat could build up. And that was the strange thing about the canyon. The same rock formations that made the area so beautiful also made the heat even harder to escape. The rocks absorbed the sun's energy and reflected that heat back onto anyone passing through, almost turning those narrow sections into something like a natural oven during the hours around midday.
I keep picturing that, walking into what basically becomes an oven, and thinking they had no way of feeling that shift even happening in real time.
The layout of the trail also created another problem. While the route was well known and regularly visited, deeper sections of the canyon still required hikers to retrace their steps to return to the trailhead. Once the group continued farther into the canyon, turning back meant covering the same exposed terrain again, this time during the hottest part of the day. If someone needed to leave, the only realistic choice was often to turn around and walk the same distance they had already covered. Based on recovered evidence and the group's final known movements, investigators believed the group had reached deeper sections of Golden Canyon before turning back. The route did not require a formal permit, and investigators relied on available records such as trailhead information, vehicle location, witness accounts, and recovered evidence to reconstruct the group's movements. Although the trail was more accessible than many backcountry routes in the park, extreme summer heat could still leave hikers effectively on their own if they became unable to continue or reach emergency services. What follows next has been reconstructed from a combination of confirmed physical records and eyewitness statements gathered during the subsequent investigation. Trailhead records and later reconstruction placed the group's arrival near the trailhead in the late morning. Investigators determined that the group had planned for an earlier start, but delays leaving their motel and a stop for supplies, including gas and ice, pushed their actual start time closer to midday. A trail information register near the trailhead contained a single entry believed to be associated with the group, including an estimated return time of early evening that was never met. Phone records later indicated that the devices stopped showing connectivity after the group entered an area with limited service. Beyond these confirmed data points, certain details, the exact timing of decisions made along the trail, and the specifics of encounters with other hikers have been reconstructed through recovered gear, witness statements, and forensic examination of the group's equipment once it was recovered. A retired couple arriving at the trailhead around noon later provided investigators with an additional account of the group's movements that morning. The couple recalled seeing 3 young men preparing to enter the canyon and briefly discussing the heat warning posted at the kiosk. They later told investigators that they remembered seeing the group begin the hike around midday, when temperatures were already rising. The couple could not identify the hikers with absolute certainty at the time, but after photographs of the missing individuals were released, both stated that they believed the group they encountered was the same 3 men.
Starting around noon is the part that gets me. That's basically walking straight into the worst window of the day.
These reconstructed elements are presented as such throughout, drawn from the best available evidence rather than direct observation by investigators. The delay was not significant on its own, but in Death Valley, losing those morning hours meant they entered the canyon much closer to the hottest part of the day. They got started later than expected because they had a slower morning leaving their motel, then made a quick stop for things like gas and ice before heading into the park. It wasn't a huge delay, just the kind of thing that normally wouldn't matter much on a regular hike. But in Death Valley, even a little lost time could make a difference. It meant they had less room before reaching the most dangerous part of the day, when the heat would build up the most between noon and 5 in the afternoon. Early on, they passed the heat warning signs posted at the trailhead. These were the same warnings park officials had placed there that summer, reminding hikers about the dangerous heat conditions affecting the region. The signs advised people to avoid heavy activity during the hottest hours, and they also recommended carrying much more water than what a normal distance-based hiking estimate might suggest. And that was the difficult part. The warning on the sign didn't really match the calculation Colton had used when planning their water supply. The formula worked for a typical hike, but this wasn't a typical day in Death Valley.
This is the gap that worries me most. Following good advice for the wrong conditions is still following the wrong advice.
Photos recovered from Mackey's phone helped investigators piece together the group's movement through the canyon. Early images showed the 3 still appearing relaxed, wearing their hats and sunglasses, with their packs still full and no obvious signs of exhaustion. Later photos showed the canyon beginning to narrow around them, with the walls rising higher on both sides and the sunlight becoming more limited as they moved deeper inside. About halfway through the hike, the group came across one of the few shaded spots in the canyon, a small area beneath a rock overhang where 2 hikers with desert hiking experience were taking a break. The 2 hikers had started before sunrise to avoid the worst of the afternoon heat. By the time they crossed paths, they were already heading back toward the trailhead, while the 3 friends were continuing deeper into the canyon.
I find it interesting that the 2 groups were basically moving in opposite directions. one group already leaving the heat behind, while the other was still heading further in.
Later, after the group was reported missing, the researchers voluntarily shared what they remembered with investigators. Their account ended up becoming the only first-hand description of what the group's hike looked like during that part of the day. According to those statements, the researchers, having already spent several hours in the canyon and observed conditions well beyond that day's forecasted highs, advised the group to consider turning back. They later recalled warning that temperatures deeper in the canyon would likely be even more dangerous during the afternoon hours, that shade would become increasingly limited as the day progressed, and that anyone continuing farther would face a much longer return trip during the hottest part of the day. According to the researchers' account, the group seemed confident when they were warned about the conditions ahead. The researchers later remembered explaining that the heat deeper inside the canyon would likely become even more dangerous as the day went on, and that turning back sooner would make the return much easier. They pointed out that the route ahead offered fewer places to rest, less shade, and a much longer walk back once they committed farther into the canyon. From the researchers' perspective, the warning was not meant to scare them away from hiking. It was simply a reminder that conditions were changing, and that the safest choice was to be cautious while they still had an easy way out. But the warning didn't seem to change their plans. According to the researchers' later statements, one member of the group appeared to brush off the concern by tipping his bottle and letting a small amount of water spill onto the trail, while joking that they had plenty to spare. Another member laughed, and the group continued talking casually, giving the impression that they believed they had the situation under control.
That water spilling on the ground is such a small gesture, but hearing it described like that makes my stomach turn a little, knowing what's coming.
To the researchers, that moment stood out because of how relaxed the group appeared despite the conditions around them. They were not acting distressed, exhausted, or confused. Their gear was still packed, they were moving normally, and nothing about the encounter suggested that they were already in trouble. Still, the entire interaction was brief. There was no argument, no long discussion, and no reason for either group to believe anything unusual was about to happen. The researchers did not know the hikers personally, and the hikers had no way of knowing that this would be the last conversation they would have with anyone outside their group. The two groups never exchanged names, destinations, or contact information. Investigators later confirmed that no such details were found in either group's belongings, phones, or personal items.
I think that's something that happens a lot on trails. You can have a normal conversation with another group of hikers and never even learn who they are.
After only a few minutes, the researchers continued back toward the trailhead while the three friends moved deeper into the canyon. The entire encounter lasted only a few minutes. After that, the three friends continued farther along the trail, eventually disappearing around a bend in the canyon. Meanwhile, the two researchers kept heading in the opposite direction, making their way back toward the trailhead the group had left behind earlier that morning. Phone data recovered from the scene showed that the group's devices lost signal shortly after this point in the hike, consistent with the canyon's already documented dead zones noted in park trail advisories. From here forward, the group continued largely out of contact with the outside world, moving farther from the trailhead, farther from the researchers who had been the last people to see them, and farther from any point along the route where their condition could be observed or reported by anyone else. No further photographs were recovered from any of the three phones after this point in the hike, a gap investigators attributed to either battery conservation or a shift in focus away from documenting the trip.
No more photos after this point is the detail that hits me the hardest. It's like watching the story just go dark.
Investigators also recovered a damaged hydration bladder among the group's equipment. They could not determine when the damage occurred or how much water may have been lost before recovery. While it was considered a possible contributing factor, investigators could not establish that the equipment failure alone significantly changed the outcome. The two hikers would later become the last known people to report seeing the group before they disappeared into the canyon. After that moment, there were no more photos, no videos, no messages, and no other witnesses who could say what happened next. So everything that investigators later learned came from piecing together the evidence left behind. They reviewed recovered gear, photo timestamps, and available location metadata, canyon conditions, witness statements, search records, and autopsy findings. Based on where their belongings were found and the timing of their last GPS-tagged photos, investigators believed the group had reached, or was close to reaching, the point where they decided to turn back toward the trailhead. But on the return route, something seemed to change. Investigators documented disturbed sections of sand along the return route, though they noted that footprints could have been affected by environmental conditions and later search activity. Now, they were careful not to overstate what that meant. The heat and conditions had already affected the area, but the scene appeared consistent with the group moving more slowly as they made their way back. And this was probably where the situation started becoming much more serious. By that point, the group's water supply was running low, and the canyon had already taken in hours of intense sunlight. They were now facing the same heat as before, except they had less water water, less energy, and a longer walk ahead of them. The return path also gave them very little relief. The same canyon walls that made the trail so memorable were now holding and reflecting the heat back onto them. The small patches of shade that may have helped earlier in the day had shifted or disappeared completely as the sun moved across the sky. Later, investigators found heavy salt staining on the group's clothing, which was consistent with prolonged sweating in extreme heat. Empty water containers were also found with all 3 sets of gear, suggesting that they had continued using, sharing, and rationing whatever water they had left as they tried to make their way back.
Reading about that salt staining actually gets to me. That's just the body doing everything it can to fight the heat while they kept walking.
The physical evidence suggested that one hiker, believed to be Colton based on recovered personal effects, became incapacitated approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. Investigators could not determine with certainty whether he was the first member of the group to collapse, but his location became a key reference point in the reconstruction. His pack was found nearby, unopened water containers no longer among its contents, consistent with the supply having already been exhausted by that point. A second hiker's remains were recovered within several yards of the first, a positioning that suggested he remained in the immediate area after Colton became incapacitated. Investigators could not determine why he stayed, only that his equipment and location indicated little additional travel beyond that point. Investigators noted that this hiker's gear showed no sign of having continued farther down the trail, reinforcing the assessment that he stayed at the location rather than attempting to press on.
I keep thinking about that second hiker staying behind, whether it was loyalty or he just couldn't go any further himself.
The third hiker's body was found almost a mile farther down the trail, closer to the direction of the trailhead. According to the final investigation review, that location suggested he had continued moving forward even after the other 2 had stopped making progress. Investigators believed he may have been trying to reach help, but they couldn't know for certain. There was no direct evidence left behind that could confirm exactly what he was thinking or what his plan was at that point. Along that final stretch of trail, investigators also found several personal items, including a hat and a pair of sunglasses that had been left behind in different spots. The placement of those items was consistent with someone who was still trying to move forward, while struggling physically, possibly dropping or removing gear as conditions became harder to handle.
A hat and sunglasses left behind, dropped one at a time. That's such a small physical detail, but it paints the whole picture for me.
Autopsy findings indicated physiological signs consistent with severe dehydration and fatal heat stroke in all 3 individuals. There were no signs of traumatic injury noted in any of the 3, no indication of foul play, and no pre-existing medical conditions identified that would have independently explained the deaths. Investigators stated plainly that no one could ever know with full certainty what each of the 3 experienced or understood in the final hour before losing consciousness. But the totality of the evidence gathered, the dehydration levels recorded during autopsy, the spacing and positioning of the bodies along roughly 1.5 miles of trail, the footprint and gear patterns observed along the return route, and the environmental data logged for that afternoon pointed toward a progressive collapse consistent with patterns documented in prior fatal, unsupported desert hikes under similar conditions. Family members first contacted the motel where the group had been staying, then contacted park dispatch once it became clear no one had heard from any of the 3 since the previous morning. A search was launched by park rangers roughly 30 hours after the group's last confirmed sign-in at the trailhead register. Ground search teams were assigned to the canyon while helicopter crews conducted aerial sweeps of the route, helping coordinators cover terrain that would have taken significantly longer to search on foot alone. Search coordinators used the trailhead register entry, the group's vehicle still parked in the lot, and witness accounts to focus the search on the Golden Canyon route. The phone data provided limited information about the device's last known connectivity, but the main search focus came from the group's planned route and the physical evidence left behind. All 3 bodies were located within a 36-hour search window from the point the search began, each recovered from the locations described in the reconstruction above. The 2 researchers later contacted investigators after learning about the search, providing the only first-hand account of the group's condition, behavior, and response to warnings before they disappeared from public view. Their statements were used both to establish a timeline for the group's movements and to provide context regarding the group's apparent confidence and response to warnings during the hike. The medical examiner's findings identified hyperthermia complicated by severe dehydration as the cause of death for all 3, with no other contributing factors identified in any of the 3 autopsies. In its after-action report, the park cited the group's underestimation of their water needs relative to the day's conditions, their decision to undertake the hike during a period of dangerous heat, and a possible loss of water from damaged equipment discovered during recovery as contributing factors factors in the outcome, though the report emphasized that the outcome resulted from multiple factors interacting together rather than from a single moment or decision. The investigation did not identify one single mistake that fully explained the sequence of events. Instead, it pointed to a combination of factors: a late start, a hike during extreme heat, a decision to continue after warnings, limited water availability, and a possible equipment failure that gradually removed the group's margin for survival.